Well, you can see the winds blowing. It's cold, it's winter, the winds are blowing. So what am I doing out here? Well, if you don't have the money for a studio, that's what you do, is you video outdoors. Now I think today, considering over the last week or two we've had what's called a worldwide outage, that we look at the proposal or the idea about decentralisation. Over the last 100 years, there has been a huge shift of population from rural areas into large mega cities, some with 20, 30 million people in them. And the thing about these mega cities, or these larger cities, a significant majority, over 90%, have been built as ports. Because obviously trade being important in human history, it was important to have a mechanism via which goods could reach different places. So most of these cities are now in low-lying areas, and as we see in Indonesia, in the capital, the city is sinking. But the problem isn't just the fact that almost 70%, that's right, 70% of the world's population now lives in large cities, and most of them live in low-lying areas. These cities have been established in low-lying areas because of the historical background. The fact is, with the impending climate emergency, which little is being done about, increasing sea levels will become an issue. As I told you, it's cold out here. And as increasing sea levels become an issue, hundreds of millions of people will be displaced. So we should be thinking, especially in Australia, where almost 75% of the population lives in 5 major cities that are all port cities: Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth. Now these are all port cities. These are all in low-lying areas. And we should be thinking about decentralisation, something people have spoken about for over a century in this country, as a possible solution, not just to the problem of climate emergency and increasing sea levels, but as a solution to the problems that we saw with this worldwide outage of the centralisation of services in a very reduced number of hubs, so that when a problem arises, it affects everybody simultaneously, and there are no mechanisms. If that problem continues, if there's no solution to that problem, and what will happen is that we will see dislocation at a wide level. Now the dilemma, as far as energy is concerned in this country, which we touched on before, is the fact that although we are now moving from a fossil fuel economy based on gas and oil to an economy based on solar and wind, the dilemma is we are creating or recreating the same centralised sources of energy production. And that has a significant number of issues. One, because of the climate emergency. Two, because of the increasing hostile nature of the relationships between sovereign nation states. Three, because of the increase in authoritarian rulers as people look for simple solution to what are inherently difficult problems. So we should be looking at this in a number of ways. One, how do we encourage people to move from the cities into regional centres? How do we decentralise work? How do we create mechanisms of transport and communication which do not rely on an inefficient road network? How do we create energy systems that are decentralised, not centralised? Decentralised communities increase the ability to communities not only to be viable and independent, but to be able to survive in situations where there are major outages. Because it's not just about having a backup system in the virtual world, it's about having a system which is there, which, while there are no issues, creates and provides energy for the whole of the country, but which, at the flick of a switch, if there are major issues, can actually provide energy, and energy is critical in 21st century society, to the communities that are serviced by that particular decentralised energy source. But the first thing is, how do you encourage people to move from the cities to the country? Now, historically, in Australia, there's been an interesting post-colonial mechanism of encouraging people to move, and that's by providing free land. In an era where almost 50% of the population, especially younger people, have to rely on renting to keep a roof over their head, and many people, especially on lower incomes, will never have the opportunity to actually own their own homes, the provision of free land by the government, which historically we saw in the 1890s and again in the 1920s, to people decreases the costs to the individual and encourages people to move out of the cities. At the same time, what we need to be looking at is rapid communication systems, mass transit systems. And what I mean by mass transit systems, I'm talking about an extension of the railway network. Now, obviously, there are many sections of society which would find this difficult, and more than difficult, many sections of society which would resist it, because the way our transport networks have developed is to allow trucking corporations to actually dominate the movement of goods on this continent. Now, people say, where does the money come from? Where are the resources? We've got a labour shortage. The fact is that the way this country's economy has been created, it's been created to satisfy the needs of a minority of shareholders in major corporations, not by providing the basic necessities to the people in this country. So this would need a profound shift. A shift which parliamentary democracy, unless there is a crisis, is unwilling to broach. And even now, when there's not a crisis, there is no incentive to decentralise. But the outage a week or two ago highlights the need. The sabre rattling which is occurring between the so-called West and the rest of the world, and the ensuring possibility of catastrophic warfare, again, is an impetus to change And obviously, on top of all this is the climate emergency. As we continue to produce goods and services to create profits, not to satisfy basic human needs. So we will be seeing a major transformation, but we need to begin that transformation today. Possibly initially in terms of debate. Instead of relying on private enterprise to create employment opportunities in a decentralised society, you could rely on the state and the cooperative and collectivist sector to create those employment opportunities. Instead of relying on an export-based economy, we should be looking at an economy that initially is based on self-sufficiency and then export of surplus production. Today, what we have is an economy which is based on importation of most of the basic necessities required in society, while relying on exports of a limited number of agricultural and mining goods in order for the economy to chug along or prosper for a reduced minority. So there are very good reasons that we should look at, discuss decentralisation, not just in terms of the current parameters which define. The first step is debate, putting the ideas out there, not just in terms of, creating a new city somewhere, but in terms of creating many cities around the continent, possibly most of them 50, 60 kilometres from the coast. Cities that have a transport network which is created for mass transports of goods and people. At the same time, we should be looking at the current economy. Why should we allow a few corporations to exploit this country's mineral resources and pocket most of the profits that are made when we can nationalise these resources and use the wealth that is created from the exploitation of these resources to create this decentralised society? At the same time, instead of creating huge solar mega farms and wind farms which are owned by private corporations, it's time that we looked at creating solar farms and wind farms which provide energy to specific areas. And obviously, during a time of crisis, most of the communities which have these decentralised energy sources will be able to continue to function and prosper. At the same time, we should be seeing governments at the state and federal level, especially at the federal level, talk about compulsorily acquiring land to create new communities. And at the same time, we should be looking at methods of production which ensure the growth of local production, not just in terms of services, but in terms of the manufacture of essential goods and services. Now, most of you would have noticed over the last few months the shortage in many pharmacies of essential health care products, including prescription medications. And this has occurred because many of these prescription medications are now have fallen out of favour with corporations because they no longer have an exclusive right to market these medications, and as prices fall and there's no profitability for them, they will stop producing medications which are essential for society. While at the same time in this country we have no pharmaceutical industry which could have picked up the slack and created these pharmaceuticals. With a rapid transport mechanism, initially maybe highways but eventually railways, you can resolve the issue of creating goods and not only exporting those goods overseas but ensuring that those goods reach all parts of the community. So decentralisation of energy sources, decentralisation of an economy which is manipulated and controlled by a handful of corporations, decentralisation of decision-making power, decentralisation of transport, and most importantly of all, the movement of people, not by force, but by giving people options which they no longer have in a society where the price of real estate is beyond the means of a significant proportion of the population, especially among young people who are burdened by debt because of their education. So it's time to think about these things, because if we continue to go the way we are going, we will create a period of crisis. A period of crisis which will be spurred on by war between totalitarian regimes. A period of crisis which will occur because of significant climate emergencies around the globe and in this country. And a period of crisis because of the inability to have an economy which is able to produce the goods and services which are necessary for people to survive and prosper. So think about it. The time for change, the time for a change in our thinking as far as centralising more services, centralising more people, centralising more energy sources, centralising this virtual world. We have now come to a juncture in human history where centralisation ideas need to be replaced by not just ideas based on decentralisation, but a growing movement which demands decentralisation to avert a possible catastrophe in the future.